Hi, I'm Praveen. I'm a senior engineer at Seek. Today I'm here to talk about container security best practices throughout the container lifecycle. And I have 5 minutes to do that. Easy, no pressure. If I have to do that without sounding like a robot reading a document, I have to find a fun way of doing that. So let's all travel back in time to 2017. So if it is in a container, it has to be secure, right? While it is true to an extent in practice, not so much. So while we are in 2017, let's revisit some of the great talks from Container Camp 2017 that mention some of the best practices. These are the talks from which I picked the best practices from. This is a talk from awesome Scott Colton. This talk motivated me to think about container security best practices during CI/CD pipeline. So some of the practices that help me to secure my CI/CD pipelines is doing static analysis, scanning the images, signing the images, and using official base images, and locking down the image registry. Next up is runtime security. It is important for us to understand how runtime works for us to secure that. This brings me to this talk from Alexa, again from 2017 Container Camp. And some of the practices that help me to secure the container runtimes are reviewing the default security configuration that comes with the container runtime, ensuring container runtime security policy is the same across different runtimes if we have a dynamic hybrid environment, restricting the use of privileged containers, and restricting access to container runtime or daemon APIs. Next up is Orchestrator security, which brings me to this talk from 2017 Container Camp AU, which talks about orchestrating least privilege. And some of the practices that were mentioned here are ensuring cluster level policies go through some review process, using RBAC and network policies, and being aware of third-party plugins and minimize their usage, and scanning app manifest security best practices and logs, which helps us with forensics. As fun as it is to stay in Container Camp 2017, I have an obligation to take us all back to 2019, and I have less than 2 minutes to do that. So let's go to 2018, which brings me to this talk from Container Camp 2018 by Ian Lewis. Even though this talk is about Kubernetes security best practices, some of the network security practices that were mentioned here are really interesting, and they help me a lot to improve the network security. So some of the practices that were mentioned are firewall the internet-facing services, locking down layer 3 and layer 4 policies using network policy, and creating a granular layer 7 policy using service mesh. Use mutual TLS authentication if you want to connect different containerized workloads, and logging, which helps us with forensics again. Next up is host security. Even though this talk from 2018 Container Camp is not specifically about host security, some of the interesting things mentioned were about threat modeling for containers and how do we detect those threats. And she also mentioned a lot of host security concepts. Some of the concepts that were mentioned here are providing write or exit access to the containers only when we need them, basically locking down the operating system, right? And even better, use an operating system that has smaller attack surface and which is locked by default. We can use seccomp profiles to even lock down operating system containers, and maybe SC Linux to isolate containers. I haven't personally tried this, but I would love to try these ones. Utilizing container sandboxing projects like Firecracker Containerd and Kata containers seems very interesting and very promising. Back to the future. Thank you.